If your lungs burn when you spray primer on your plague guard, congratulations, you're not just painting, you're embracing Nurgle's blessing. Which makes sense because it's Nurgle's November. You could probably hear it in my voice. A whole month dedicated to Grandfather Nurgle, the Lord of Decay himself. So if you want more lore videos, terrain tutorials, and episodes of the Greater Walk all dripping with the plague-ridden goodness, subscribe and help us spread the joy. Today, we're diving into the origins of the Death Guard, the Emperor's most resilient sons, and their tragic fall alongside their Primarch, Mortarion. From the toxic peaks of Barbarous to the festering bellies of the Warp, this is a story of how honor decayed, and the Death Guard were reborn as Nurgle's chosen.
Before the Imperium of Man feared the sight of the traitorous Death Guard, the Legion was a stalwart defender of humanity. Each and every battle brother was perfectly equipped to endure and prevail against any foe encountered on the battlefield. Before they were reunited with their Primarch Perturabo, the Legion was referred to as the Dusk Raiders, and they fought with the surety that only such an adaptable military force could achieve. Like the rest of the Astarte legions, the Dusk Raiders were created towards the end of the Unification Wars and the beginning of the Great Crusade. The majority of the first recruits were drawn from Holy Terra itself, specifically the ancient and warlike clans of Old Albia, which were situated in the southeastern part of Europe. The Emperor of Mankind chose the Sons of Albia not just for the Dust Raiders, but also the Night Lords and the Iron Hands Legion. There were two major reasons why the Emperor chose Old Albia. Firstly, by collecting the strongest and most resilient warriors from their old rival, the Emperor ensured that the techno-barbarian warlords remained loyal to the Great Crusade. Secondly, the Emperor wished to incorporate the martial traditions and old bloodlines of Albia into his crusading force. By absorbing their children, the Emperor inherited the warrior spirit of an old nation that had held power on Holy Terra for so long during the Old Night. It adopted the history of this ancient human culture. It was the ancient Albion warriors, led by the relentless warlord, Narthan Doom, that saw a tremendous victory over the ancient Pan-Pacific Empire during the Age of Strife. Eventually, the people of Old Albia earned their freedom from the tyrannical descendants of the unspeakable king through brutal wars of attrition. It was no surprise to the Emperor that Old Albia refused to surrender or plead fealty to the Imperium of Man during the Unification Wars. Having cast off the shackles of tyranny, they were not going to accept any other ruler without a fight. Instead, the Albions met the Emperor's regiments of Thunder Warriors with their own battalions of steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts and heavily armored Ironside soldiers. In battle after battle, the forces of the Unification were held in check, although at the shattering cost of the Albions, who would not give in despite the Imperial onslaught. Impressed with the Albions' martial temper and indomitable courage, the Emperor called for a ceasefire and sought victory over the warlord clans through peaceful negotiations. Understanding that to crush them by force alone would entail a grinding war of attrition that would only serve to decimate his own forces and gain him nothing but a handful of ashes as a prize of war. Eventually, the Emperor chose to pursue peace despite counsel against this action by his generals. The Mentor of Mankind approached the ancient warrior nation, unarmed and clothed in white and crimson. The Emperor spoke of the warlords' parliament and laid before them a vision of a future of mankind, reunited, and of tyrants toppled and nightmares slain. He offered them glory amongst the stars, and most importantly, redemption for the many hundreds of years of kinslaying and bloodshed. To the shock of many, the warlords of Old Albia accepted the Emperor's vision. In doing so, the Albion clans became amongst the Unification's most zealot supporters, although still untrusted by many, lending their warriors and secrets for the Emperor's eyes alone. Most importantly for the future of humanity, the Albions sacrificed their sons to become the first Space Marines. These warriors were spread throughout the legions, but their stoic temperament matched best with the gene seed of the indomitable Dusk Raiders. As a matter of fact, the name Dusk Raiders was bestowed onto them because of the battlefield tactics inherited from the old Albion warlords. The Legion preferred to conduct all major ground attacks at the fall of night, when the shift of the light confused the enemy. They utilized the encroaching shadows from a disappearing sun to advance across the battlefield, making it seem as if the Legion rose from the darkness. Many armies would simply run away from the fear caused by this terrifying and mystical assault. Their reputation became synonymous with the chilling grasp of death. In defense, they were stubborn and unmovable, able to stand unwavering against the heaviest fire and hold their position against any enemy to the last living body in the bolter shell if needed. In attack, they systematically destroyed a given target, crashing upon an enemy with wave after wave of armored bodies, excelling in close-range fights and bloody attrition. Their gray and unadorned power armor began to carry symbols of rank and decoration. It once carried the armorial imagery of the Ironsides of Old Albia, and most telling, their right vambrans, gauntlets, and shoulder plates were painted the deep crimson of dried blood. Now they symbolized the red right hand of the Emperor's justice, where once it had proclaimed the murderous reach of the Pan-Pacific Empire's unspeakable king. The Dusk Raiders adopted the Legion's badge of a half skull with a setting sun on the other half. This, of course, was a representation of the Legion's favorite battlefield tactic, and as a way to pay respect for their ancestors of old Albia. This extreme pride for their past would cause friction once they were reunited with their Primarch Mortarion, and recruits began to come in from the feral world of Barbarous. As relentless as they were in the attack, the Dusk Raiders were known to be honorable opponents as well, who would hold to bargains struck for early surrender and honor symbols of truce. When such terms lapsed, however, and the die was cast for destruction, it was just a widely known fact that nothing would stay in the Dusk Raiders' hands. Such honorable terms were only extended to human foes, worthy of being brought into the fold of Imperial compliance. However, to the degenerate, the mutant, the alien, no such mercies were ever given. The Dusk Raiders fought in the service of the Great Crusade for the next 8 solar decades, still fatherless during this time, as the other Space Marine legions gained their long-lost Primarchs until only a handful remained to be rediscovered. This orphan status further bred a self-reliance and a quite stubborn pride in the Dusk Raiders' self-forged character. The Dusk Raiders are noted in the Imperial records of this period as maintaining a well-rounded capacity for unleashing multiple modes of warfare, although with some bias towards heavy assault formations and attrition engagements, as evidenced by the particular use of close-range weaponry within the Legion. The Dusk Raider Legion relied upon its infantry to provide its strategic strength, with the bolt of tactical fire support coming from heavy armed support squads, and later with a considerable number of Terminators and Dreadnoughts providing reinforcement in an assault spearhead when needed. If the Death Guard would have remained loyal to the Emperor, or if one of the many Terran-born Astartes that became Black Shields during the Horus Heresy somehow managed to create a successor, that chapter would possess the same independence and reliability as the Dusk Raiders.
Now that we know the origin of the Death Guard, let's take a look at the origins of their Primarch Mortarion.
The Primarch Mortarion came to rest on the planet of Barbarous. Of all the worlds upon which the Primarchs were scattered, few were as terrible a place as this damned feral world, orbiting near a dim yellow sun in the Segmentum Tempestus. It created a thick, miasmic atmosphere of toxic chemicals. The most virulent of these gases rose through Barbarous's perpetual clouds towards the heat of its star, making the world beneath a dismal place of night, unbroken by starlight and possessed of short, shadowy days. When humans first settled Barbarous during the Dark Age of technology, the horrific environmental conditions from which they eked out a living quickly reduced them to a pre-feudal state. Unfortunately, the Age of Strife separated the planet from the rest of humanity. Quickly, the world became the domain of savage, alien overlords who ruled over and entrapped and preyed upon human population as cruel and terrible gods. The only atmosphere breathable by humans existed only in the lowest elevations, on flat moors, and in the valley basins of the jagged, stony mountains which spine the world. These unknown alien overlords were immune to the toxic soup of the planet's upper atmosphere, building great keeps of gray stone in the mountain's fastness. The true nature of these dark overlords, beyond their obvious connection to the dark entities of the Immaterium, will likely never be known. What is known is that they reveled in the death of the humans that cowered from their power. One of the greatest of these overlords stood in triumph over a freshly murdered battlefield, reveling in his massacre until the silence was shattered by a child's cry. Legend tells that the warlord walked the sea of corpses for a day and night in his creaking battle armor, drawn by the wails of the infant. When he finally found him, he considered ending its young life, but no mere human ought to be able to breathe the poisonous miasma at the height of Barbarous, much less cry out as this child did. For a long moment he contemplated this thing which appeared to be human, but was clearly much more. He chose to gather up the infant and carry him away from the carnage. For all his dark power, until that moment he had not had what this child now promised: a son, an heir, born of death upon a field of death. The warlord christened the infant Mortarion, the child of death. When Mortarion was taken by the overlord, his master tested the infant's limits. When he determined precisely how high into the toxic clouds of Barbarous's peaks the child could survive, he erected a stony keep and fenced it behind black iron. He then moved his own home beyond, to the highest peak, where the atmosphere was deadly, even to the new Primarch. Mortarion grew to adolescence in such a world, a citadel of weeping gray stone and cast iron fences, where the very air was death, and the sun never more than a distant smudge. It was a world of constant war against opposing lords, who came with golem armies of stitched-together dead one day, then tormented shapeshifters, more monster than men the next. While the Primarch was shaped by this environment, he was still a child of the Emperor, superhumanly resilient to the poisonous air around him, and superhumanly strong even in the absence of sufficient sunlight or nourishment. Mortarion possessed an intellect which was highly keen, and which asked questions his lord did not want to answer. Increasingly, the questions centered around the fragile things in the valley below, which the warlord preyed upon for their corpses to reanimate, or victims to a curse. The warlord kept Mortarion as distant from the human settlements as he could, but his very act of denial fed the maturing Primarch's obsession. The day finally came when Mortarion would not be denied any longer. Mortarion slipped through the dungeons from his keep. The last thing he heard was the voice of the Overlord, the only father he had known, roaring in the miasmic darkness from the highest battlement as Mortarion descended from the mountain. He renounced the Primarch for his betrayal, warning Mortarion that should he return, it would mean death. Descending beneath the mist was a revelation to Mortarion. His lungs were filled with air free of poison from the first time. He smelled aromas of food being prepared, of crops freshly harvested, hearing voices unmuffled by the fog, and for the first time heard laughter. The young Primarch realized that he was amongst his own kind, that the fragile prey of the warlord were his own people, and with that realization came rage. He was determined to bring them the justice denied by the dark powers which moved above. Mortarion's acceptance amongst the human settlers of Barbarous was no simple thing. While he felt like one of them, to them he was little different from the monsters above. Towering over even the tallest of his fellow Barbarians, gaunt and pallid, with hollow, haunted eyes which betrayed the horrors he had seen, Mortarion terrified most of the settlers. They looked upon him with suspicion and fear. It stung the young Primarch, but he bid his time, using his great strength to work the fields for their meager harvest, knowing that his opportunity to prove himself would soon come. When it finally did, in the twilight hours, he was ready. The village was eventually attacked by a lesser lord and his corpse army. The villagers fought back with their farmers' tools and torches, but were unable to prevent the shambling creatures from carrying out their master's dark purposes. Mortarion then strode forth, a large two-handed scythe in his hand, and charged into the ranks of the enemy and annihilated them with the Primarch's born rage. Their Dark Lord smiled at Mortarion as the Primarch neared, withdrawing into the poisonous heights where he thought his rebellious human could not reach him. He was still wearing his contemptuous smile when Mortarion caught up with him on the mountainside and exacted his vengeance for the frail prey below. After that night, Mortarion's place among the settlers was never in doubt. As he matured, Mortarion taught the settlers of Barbarous what he knew of warfare. Word of his exploits spread, and many others made the perilous journey to learn. Slowly, villages became strong points, and the villagers more effective defenders. Eventually, Mortarion went amongst the people, traveling from settlement to settlement, teaching, building, and when occasion demanded, defending them. Always, however, his ultimate justice was denied. The dark powers could always retreat into their impregnable bulwark of their poisonous mists. His people could only fight in defense, but that had to change. Mortarion recruited the toughest, most resilient of Barbarous's population, forging them into small units which he drilled himself, teaching them not only defense, but also how to attack. He turned blacksmiths from tool working to weapon making when time allowed, and crafters to the shape of armor. And with the best artificers he could find, he bent his formidable intellect to the problem of the poisonous air. When one of the overlords descended from the poisonous fog blanketing the mountainside, the villagers not only managed to mount a successful defense, but were led by Mortarion into the poisonous fog, where the overlord's army thought it would escape the marauding humans. Masked with crude filtering hoses and breathing apparatuses, the Primarch led his retinue to bring death in the realm of death. They killed the warlord and massacred his army. The Primarch continued to improve the breathing apparatuses of his new Death Guard as his retinue of warriors came to be known, campaigning ever higher into the darker overlord's domain, encountering ever more virulent pestilence. The constant exposure to the higher doses of toxins toughened the Death Guard. Mortarion and his army warred for solar months across the poisonous spines of Barbarous, until only one grim but very familiar citadel stood against them. The concentration of poisonous toxins was such that they threatened to overcome the Death Guard and the Primarch himself, forcing him to withdraw. Mortarion would not get vengeance against his adopted father until the Emperor arrived.
Once united with his legion, Mortarion fell. Now, his apotheosis to demonhood is a very interesting story. Let's get into it.
Mortarion, Primarch and commander of the Death Guard Space Marine Legion, was forced to accept demonhood like many of his fellow traitor Primarch brothers during the Horus Heresy. His ascension to demonhood came to a climax right before the assault on Terra by the forces of the traitorous Primarchs. En route to the Emperor's last bastion, Mortarion and his entire Death Guard Legion fleet became trapped in the Immaterium due to the actions of the first captain, Callus Typhon, an already established worshipper of the plague god Nurgle. It was while on campaign with the Wordbearer's Legion earlier in the Great Crusade that Typhon had learned of a different path for the Legion of Astartes to follow, a future where his hard-won but hidden psychic abilities would be a source of greatness instead of a taboo to be hidden from sight. The foremost chaplain of the Wordbearers, Erebus, inducted Typhon into the secret of the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the warrior lodges that had begun to spread throughout the Space Marine legions in the later days of the Great Crusade. It was during this time that Typhon got a glimpse of what the Astartes could truly become if they shrugged off the yoke of the Emperor's ambition. Perhaps Typhon's revelation was instrumental in Mortarion's own fall to the ruinous powers. Perhaps Mortarion would have walked a dark path on his own. Either way, the troubled Death Guard Primarch saw a worthy leader in Horus, whereas in the Emperor he saw only a self-serving and pompous pretender who had stolen Mortarion's hard-won kingship in a single day, while engaging in hypocrisy concerning his own use of the warp. As the heresy reached its conclusion, Mortarion ordered his fleet to head to Terra with all hastes, intended for the Death Guard to join the other traitor legions in the destruction of the false Emperor. By this point, Typhon served one master alone, and it was not his Primarch. Typhon had seen to it that the fleet's navigators were killed to a man, claiming that they were loyal to the Emperor, but reassured Mortarion that the warp gift he possessed would see them through their journey in the Immaterium safe and sound. Though he hated the concept of relying on what he considered witchcraft, even in one of his own Astartes, Mortarion was left with no other choice. The Death Guard fleet made transition into the warp, and in the process damned themselves to an eternity of war as the puppets of a foul and ancient god. In leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had delivered them into the clutches of his new master, Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. The strange tides of the Immaterium were notoriously fickle, and during their voyage, the entire Death Guard fleet was becalmed within its shifting dimensional tides. As their warships lingered, directionless and without hope, the cloying influence of Grandfather Nurgle began to take hold. The Death Guard were subject to the terrible infections of the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's Rot, as Nurgle's power managed to infiltrate the vessels of the Legion. It polluted the vessels themselves as easily as it did the transhuman warriors within. The virulent plagues infected the fleet while it drifted endlessly through the warp, making a mockery of the Death Guard's legendary resistance to toxins and contagions. The plague that came could not be resisted, something that terrified Mortarion and the Death Guard. It transformed them into bloated mutants, yet none could die, their own body being their undoing. None suffered more than Mortarion, for it was like being on the mountaintop again on Barbarous, surrendering to the toxins, but this time without the Emperor to save him. Eventually, Mortarion could suffer no more, and gave himself over to chaos to stop the pain. Desperate, Mortarion offered his legion and his own soul to the ruinous powers in exchange for deliverance. Nurgle responded gleefully and took the Legion and Mortarion for his own champions, as Mortarion at last swore his soul to the eternal service of the Plague God in return for an end to the ceaseless agony. Nurgle responded with his usual generosity. Mortarion was transformed into a demon prince of the Plague Father, the living embodiment of life in death and death in life. The Death Lord was at last worthy of his title. Mortarion left his humanity far behind, condemned to a deathless state of decay. From his back sprouted wings of tattered leather. His gaunt demonic face and rheumy eyes became entrapped behind his corrupted rebreather mask. A crown made of iron formed on his head that would forever poke through this tattered hood. Twisted and corrupted to resemble a morbid angel of death, Mortarion transformed into the demon Primarch of Nurgle. Mortarion would be the last Primarch to receive the blessing of demonhood by one single Chaos God, and would be the final Primarch to ascend during the Horus Heresy.
Now that we know how the Primarch fell, let's look at the first Plague Guard to fall to Nurgle's embrace.
Solon Decius was an Adeptus Astartes warrior of the Death Guard Legion that honorably fought for the Imperium during the Great Crusade era, but would tragically fall to the forces of chaos during the Horus Heresy. Decius was a member of the 7th Great Company commanded by Battle Captain Nathaniel Garro, and was the youngest member of Captain Garro's command squad. Brother Decius remained loyal to Garro despite the corruption that had begun to creep into the Space Marine legions under the War Master Horus's command in the form of warrior lodges. Since the beginning, Garro expressed his disapproval of the secretive lodges, and as a result, Decius chose not to join the warrior lodge that already existed within the Death Guard when offered membership. During the outset of the Isfahan campaign, Garro's 7th Great Company fought in concert with the Emperor's Children Elite 1st Company against the traitorous forces on the world of Isfahan Extremis, the outermost planet in the Isfahan system. While fighting against a powerful Slaneshi psyker known as the War Singer, Decius' life was saved when Garro pushed the young legionnaire out of the way of its psychic attack, which badly wounded the battle captain. Though gravely injured, Garro continued to fight on, fighting back-to-back amidst the rising tide of enemies until the battle was successfully concluded. As part of Garro's command squad, Decius was fated to be aboard the frigate Eisenstein during the Isfahan III atrocity, when his commander took control of the vessel and fled the Isfahan system through the warp in an attempt to warn of Horus's betrayal to Terra. En route to the throne world, Decius and a number of his fellow loyalist Death Guard fought a battle against the reanimated corpses of their former traitorous comrades aboard the vessel, who had become the first Plague Marines of Nurgle, when the Plague God's influence had insinuated itself through the damaged Eisenstein's killer field while the vessel was traveling through the Immaterium. During the battle, Decius was injured when he was stabbed by one of the Plague Marines' plague knives, and in a vain attempt to halt the advance of the supernatural corruption caused by this chaos artifact, he bravely cut off his own arm. The severely wounded Astarte was then taken to the Apothecarion and put under the care of Apothecary Merrick Voyan, but there was no cure available in the entire corpus of Imperial medical science that could ease Decius' suffering. After completing their arduous journey and delivering their message to the Emperor's acting regent, Malcador the Sigillite, Garro and his men were placed under house arrest and held in solitary confinement in the Somnus Citadel on Luna, under the watchful eyes of the Silent Sisterhood. Their fate was yet to be decided. In the meantime, the mortally wounded Decius finally lost his fight to the supernatural disease later known as Nurgle's Rot that was running rampant throughout his rotting flesh. Giving himself over fully to the offer of Nurgle to end his pain, Decius' body was possessed and metamorphosized into a mutated form of the demonic entity known as the Lord of Flies. His twisted body took on a demonic appearance. It possessed an arachnid-like head with numerous eyes and mandibles in place of the mouth, while his decapitated arm grew grotesquely into a great skeletal hand, similar to a power fist. The Lord of Flies proceeded to wreak havoc inside the fortress, killing 2 of his former comrades before Captain Garro strode forth and slew the monstrosity outside the fortress on Luna's barren, airless surface, casting the Lord of Flies' demonic spirit back into the warp from whence it came. Almost 9 standard years later, in the final days of the Horus Heresy, just before the start of the Siege of Terra, the Lord of Flies assaulted the mobile industrial platform known as the Walking City on Terra. The demon appeared as a massive horde of plague flies that infected the people of the Walking City and transformed them into fly-infested zombies. The Knights Errant were sent in to defeat the creature. During the battle, the Lord of Flies used the voice of sullen Decius to goad the leader of the Knights Errant, Nathaniel Garro, promising him that all efforts to stop chaos would be in vain, and offering him a chance to rejoin his fellow Death Guard in service to Nurgle. Decius's voice admitted that he had been consumed by a demon known as the Lord of Flies, and that this was all that was left of him. The Knights Errant succeeded in cleansing the chaos taint from the walking city, though the Lord of Flies promised he would yet be the death of Garro. Later, a force of chaos cultists struck at the White Mountain, a secret subterranean installation on Terra that was heavily protected against psychic intrusion. The facility was being used to research what had happened to a group of Sisters of Silence who had been captured by the forces of chaos during the heresy and then recovered by loyalists. In the course of the assault, the Knights Errant under Garro's command once more moved to defend the facility and were attacked by the Lord of Flies. During the battle, the demon revealed that after he had been defeated by Garro upon Luna, it possessed the body of Merrick Voyan, the apothecary of the 70, who had once tried to save Decius upon the Eisenstein after his infection. Voyan had been among the 70 Death Guard Space Marines who remained loyal after the Eisenstein arrived on Terra. The demon laughed as Garro realized that he once again would be forced to kill the body of a man who once had been his friend. Garro destroyed the Voyan host body, but the demon then moved on to possess the battle brother and former world eater, Macer Varen, and had been mortally wounded during the Battle of the White Mountain. Varen assaulted his comrades, but froze when his fellow battle brother, Garviel Loken, confronted him and tried to remind him of his friendship. Varen's soul regained enough control over his own body to grab a belt of grenades from Loken's armor and set them off. Varen chose to destroy himself rather than let the demon continue to control him. Free of the flesh once more, the demon began to hunt for another host, but Malkador the Sigillite finally entered the battle upon the White Mountain slopes and unleashed his full psychic might against the creature, blasting it to ashes. However, the Sigillite warned the chapter that like all demons, the Lord of Flies would not be completely destroyed while in real space, and would reform within the warp. The Lord of Flies would continue to plague the Imperium, and the memory of Solon Decius as his first victim would go down in the Inquisition's demonic history.
And that's today's lore on the Plague Guard. I hope you guys enjoyed. More Death Guard / Nurgle videos to come. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate signing out.